What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Motorfest. So I did want to make a video going over the summit, and I guess you could say like my thoughts on the summit in this game now, and even like the upcoming summits, plus like the overall rewards with them at this point. Now I do have to admit, guys, even though the summits in this game are slightly disappointing right now, this Hoonigan update is by far one of like my favorite updates ever in a racing game. I will also be making a video on that next week, so do stay tuned. Like, it's amazing. It's an honest blast racing around those cars, but the first thing I do want to talk about before going over the rewards is indeed going to be these summits themselves. So obviously the current one out right now is going to have 6 main events and 3 skills, similar to how they were before on the Crew 2, so there's really nothing different there. But the one thing that's different about Motorfest is probably going to come down to the way the events actually are in this game compared to like the Crew 2 before. So we do know, guys, there's obviously going to be 6 main events in the actual summits. Now, one of the main things I have been seeing many people say is there does need to be a different mix, or I guess you could say a better mix of events in the summit. That way you're actually not doing 6 street tier 1 races for that matter. I would say having a nice mix, like having something like a tier 2, and then of course adding in like a drift event, even like a hypercar, and then of course maybe throwing in like a racing event in there as well, just to mix it up and actually make it insanely different compared to before. And then of course back in the Crew 2, we also had the special event that did tend to be in the bottom right of each summit, that normally had like a weird vehicle being in a said race it probably did not belong in, which I would say made a lot of the summits pretty entertaining, but there is also going to be a lot of different vehicle classes in Motorfest that they could most likely add into these. For example, guys, one thing they can also do is maybe lock up like these skills to certain vehicle classes. So one way they could probably do this, so for the current summit, we do have a slalom, a speed trap, and an escape. What if they actually did it so for each one you have to use a certain vehicle class on them only? For example, guys, on a slalom, what if you only could use a racing vehicle or even like a motocross bike? So those would be the only two vehicle classes you could use on that said skill in that summit. And then of course looking at something like a speed trap, instead of everyone running a drag car, what if you actually had to use something like maybe even a hypercar, or even something like a street tier 2, but those were the only vehicles you can run. And I would say that would probably be like maybe class based, so for example you could probably run something like a street tier 1 vehicle only on it, and then of course maybe next week you have to use a tier 2, and then after that, you might have to use like a hypercar to really mix things up. Who knows, maybe they can even add something with like a powerboat or even like a plane in there as well, just to mix up like the overall gameplay and how the skills actually work in the summits. And then of course the exact same thing can be said for the escape as well, with only using like a racing vehicle, and you can basically only pick cars from that entire said class for that said skill. And you can also run your said part set build on each of the skills as well, but that way it actually mixes it so you have to run a said vehicle in them, and you're most likely not going to see the exact same class being used every single week. For example, in the speed trap is always going to be a drag car, and then of course on a slalom I would say the number one vehicle I see being used is an Alpha GP car, so it is probably going to make that a lot more interesting if you actually had to use a said class on them. And then, of course, in the escape is most likely 95% of the time going to be a hypercar, because none of the other vehicle classes can do 295 miles an hour. So I would say that would most likely make sense being able to do that on these said skills. And then for the main 6 events in the summit, maybe they could have like a special modifier with each one of them. For example, maybe one of them is, yeah, going to be like a street tier 1 event, where you have to use like a Ford or like a Japan vehicle or something like that, but what if there was like a modifier on that to where you could not use your nitrous? And then for the next event, let's say it's going to be locked to only a hypercar, but there's going to be a modifier on that one that you cannot use any of your part sets. So the game is basically going to give you like a random maxed out part set. Or maybe they end up making it so yeah, you can pick any hypercar of your choice, but you will not be able to use any of your said part sets for that event, and that way it actually makes it like balance out in a said way, but also it may end up mixing up the entire summit, so that way it's actually going to make it more interesting, and most likely attract more players to it. I would like to know what you guys think would be a good change for the summits, or even like the ideas you would have that you would change about them. I really do feel like many of these ideas are honestly going to be great, but the next thing I do want to talk about is indeed going to be the rewards in the summit. So this is obviously going to be the first month of the said Hoonigan update, bringing us basically 3 vanity items and the returning Bugatti Magma Edition. I would say a lot of players might actually be happy this car is coming back, but I really do feel like, guys, a lot of these rewards are probably not that great for many people, and I really can understand why. Like, for example, the Hoonigan Underglow is awesome. I would actually say this is probably like the best reward so far in this first month of this. Of course, besides the lovely Bugatti Magma, but the next one is going to be the Yellow Spangled Nitro. I would say they can easily add anything else besides this said item that would probably make it better. And then, of course, the next reward is going to be the Hoonigan Slayer Tire, which I would say most people are actually going to like this one. I mean, for example, guys, the new tire is probably going to look awesome on the new cars in the game like the Hoonicorn, or even many of the existing cars in the game for that matter, but I really do feel like a lot of players are most likely not going to care for the Yellow Spangled Nitro. Now, I do think next month we are most likely going to get one, possibly two new vehicles in this game, and that is most likely going to come down to like the second month of the said season. Now, I would like to know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below. I would most likely guess that a lot of people do probably want to see a difference with the rewards in this game. I have to admit though, guys, most likely seeing like an upgraded gold set is probably going to be a while. I would be insanely surprised if we actually see one within like the next 3 to 4 months, or even going into Season 3 for that matter. Like, we are obviously going to be into this game by barely about 4 months now. And then not only do we actually need different rewards in the summits, but also making them a lot more appealing to many people. And at the same time, I really do feel like the summits do need to be changed in some way. I mean, for example, guys, having the skills being locked to like a specific vehicle class, or even like having a specific new modifier on these said events, and then maybe not being able to use like your part sets or something, but that can also raise something to where why would I actually grind for these said part sets? So maybe they can come up with like new modifiers that would make the events more interesting, but also making it so the summits are going to be a lot more mixed up. And I would say most likely having like a different class for each event in that summit, which I do think would most likely bring a lot more people into it, or even new players for that matter that might actually want to jump in and try them out. Now I have to admit though, guys, even though the current summit this week is obviously only going to be Street Tier 1, which I would say a lot of players might not even want to try this one out because of that. Like, a lot of people are most likely using like a hypercar, or even running different drift vehicles for that matter because of the Hoonigan update. I would say though the 13th to the 20th December summit is probably going to be awesome. Basically primarily based on the Gymkhana of Hoonigan, so I really cannot wait for next week's summit, but do let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below, guys. Would you like to see a change with the summits and their events? And would you guys like to see an upgraded thing with the rewards in the near future?